You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 498 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we've been talking about different aspects of what history has called the Overland Campaign. It started when, in the spring of 1864, in Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant had set the several federal armies there in motion against the Confederates, with the spotlight being on the contest between the Army of the Potomac and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia.
It continued when Grant refused to follow the example of his predecessors in the East, whose campaigns had pretty much consisted of one-and-done attempts to best the rebels, whether it was Burnside at Fredericksburg or Hooker at Chancellorsville, or Meade at Mine Run.
But Grant broke the mold. Rather than calling off his offensive after the Wilderness, or after Spotsylvania, or after reaching the North Anna, Grant had instead continued to maneuver the Army of the Potomac around Lee's right flank, always moving farther to the southeast.
This period of unprecedented, sustained, near-continuous maneuvering and fighting came to be called the Overland Campaign.
The last time we looked at the maneuvering and fighting between the two armies, it was May 30th, 1864, and the Yankees and rebels had spent several days clashing along Totopotomoy Creek. On the 30th, as you guys will recall, Jubal Early's Confederates had tangled with the Federals of Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps, who had crossed the Totopotomoy, and to Robert E. Lee, they seemed exposed and vulnerable. Well, old Jube's attack gave Warren a scare, but in the end, the affair at Bethesda Church turned into something of a disaster for the Confederates.
We said that one other fight of note occurred on May 30th, when, that afternoon, Matthew Butler's brigade of Confederate Mounted Infantry probed northeast from a dusty intersection known as Old Cold Harbor.
By the banks of Matadequan Creek, Butler's rebels got into a sharp skirmish with a brigade from Alfred Torbert's division of Union Cavalry, which was posted in that area to screen the Army of the Potomac's supply line to White House Landing on the Pamunkey River.
Butler's Confederates made some progress early on, but the Yankees couldn't permit the enemy to remain close to such a vital point, and Torbert soon threw in his entire division, which meant it was 3 Union brigades against 1 rebel brigade.
The Federal cavalry not only forced Butler's rebels away from Matadequan Creek, but pursued them nearly to Old Cold Harbor. Well, that outcome meshed with Grant's thinking, as it had developed after the Army of the Potomac had spent those couple of days discovering that it would be fearfully expensive to try to break Robert E. Lee's line along Totopotomoy Creek. But, as the affair at Bethesda Church proved, Lee did seem willing to maneuver outside his earthworks if a chance to strike the Yankees presented itself. Grant therefore decided to move southward, beyond Lee's right flank, with Baldy Smith's 18th Corps coming from White House Landing to spearhead the shift. Grant felt sure that Robert E. Lee would catch wind of Baldy Smith's approach and try to block his path.
So, on the evening of the 30th, orders went out to the Federal Cavalry Commander, Phil Sheridan, to send at least half a brigade of horsemen swinging down from the Union left and clear the way for Smith. According to Staff Officer Horace Porter, Grant hoped that Robert E. Lee would send an entire corps against Baldy Smith. In that case, Porter said, Grant intended to, quote, move the whole army to the right and throw it between Lee and Richmond.
Baldy Smith's 18th Corps, 10,000 men strong, with more coming, had already begun to disembark at White House Landing after having been pulled out of the Bermuda Hundred lines the day before. It was a slow process, considering the limited wharf facilities, but nevertheless, Smith's arrival meant Grant would have a 5th Infantry Corps to pit against Robert E. Lee's 3. No one understood the implications of this better than Lee, who now breached protocol and wrote P.G.T. Beauregard directly for reinforcements.
As y'all will recall, Beauregard was the Confederate commander confronting the Federal threat at Bermuda Hundred, and so far he had declined to weaken his force in order to send reinforcements to Robert E. Lee.
And now, in response to Lee's plea, Beauregard responded that the War Department in Richmond would have to determine which troops, if any, could be spared from the Bermuda Hundred sector. Well, with that, Robert E. Lee's patience finally ran out, and on the evening of the 30th, he wired Jefferson Davis directly, telling the Confederate president that disaster loomed if he didn't receive reinforcements from Beauregard ASAP.
Robert E. Lee seldom used words like disaster in official correspondence, but here it worked on Davis, who now ordered Beauregard to help out. In point of fact, Beauregard had already thought better of his original response, and just minutes before Davis's wire arrived, he'd ordered Robert Hoke's division to join Lee.
Men on both sides sensed that events were moving toward a climax. The decisive battle, sought after for several weeks, was now almost certain to occur somewhere between Totopotomoy Creek and the Chickahominy River, and quite likely near the dusty crossroads called Cold Harbor.
Cold Harbor, technically Old Cold Harbor, to distinguish it from the equally unremarkable New Cold Harbor, a mile to the west, was nothing but a weathered tavern where 5 roads met.
But in the spring of 1864, those roads were of critical importance to the two armies, since they connected with the region's major highways, especially the ones leading down to the Chickahominy River crossings. As it slid around Lee's right flank once again, the Army of the Potomac's direct route to the James River led over the Chickahominy crossings, and the Federals' path to the Chickahominy crossings went through Cold Harbor. Well, both Grant and Lee understood this fact perfectly, so the key to the campaign now seemed to rest at the heart of this obscure, star-shaped intersection. Cold Harbor's population could normally be counted on one hand, but on May 31st, it numbered several thousand. On hand there were Butler's brigade of mounted infantry, the Confederates who had been shoved away from Matadequin Creek the previous day, and Fitzhugh Lee's 2-brigade division of rebel cavalry, just arrived after a long, hard ride from the Army of Northern Virginia's opposite flank. Fitz Lee commanded the combined force, and he had it spread in an arc to cover Cold Harbor's eastern approaches. He deployed pickets well forward to provide early warning of an enemy attack, and then he put most of his troopers to work throwing up fence rails, logs, and earth into hasty breastworks. But Lee knew that if he was going to hold the crossroads, he needed reinforcements, so every so often he sent a staff officer galloping down the road to his rear to see if Robert Hoke's infantry division was coming up. You see, Fitz Lee had received word of Hoke's transfer by rail from Bermuda Hundred, and that Hoke had orders to march his men to Cold Harbor once they arrived at Mechanicsville.
Around 3:30 that afternoon, Hoke's lead brigade came into view, 4 North Carolina regiments under Brigadier General Thomas Clingman. Fitz Lee sent them over to extend the left, that is, northern end of his line, and a half hour later, the Federals attacked.
They came from the northwest, 2 brigades of Torbert's Union cavalry under Wesley Merritt and George Custer, advancing astride the road that led to Matadequan Creek and the Old Church Hotel. They came dismounted, firing their Sharps and Spencer repeaters. Thwarted in their first attempt to gain the intersection, the Federals nevertheless got 2 benefits from the attack. First, they now had a better sense of the layout of the Confederate position, and second, they understood that they faced rebel infantry as well as cavalry.
Torbert conferred quickly with Merritt, who commanded the brigade closest to the rebel flank. They decided that Merritt would use part of his force to pin the enemy in front, while the rest of his troopers would work their way around to the rebels' flank and rear.
The plan worked admirably, in part because it was perfectly executed, but also because Clingman's brigade of North Carolinians was inexperienced, under strength, and badly posted. The Tar Heels had spent most of the war at home in North Carolina, where they had seen little action. They had also left one of their regiments back at Bermuda Hundred to continue to hold the brigade's section of trenches there. To make matters worse, Hoke had directed Clingman to place one of his remaining regiments, the 51st North Carolina, 500 yards in advance of the main line. Presumably intended to act as a tripwire to warn of the Yankees' approach, the 51st simply found itself outflanked and isolated by Merritt's second attack.
Still worse, Clingman had stationed himself with the 51st North Carolina, so for several crucial minutes he was isolated and unable to supervise the rest of his brigade. Eventually he made his way back to them, but not in time to organize a new defensive line. Instead, the brigade collapsed as the men fled to the rear, thereby uncovering the flank of Fitz Lee's division.
With their position compromised, Lee ordered his troopers to withdraw. Seeing the Confederates preparing to pull out, Custer ordered one of his battalions to charge, mounted with drawn sabers. The dramatic charge, wrote Custer in his report, quote, produced the desired effect. The enemy, without waiting to receive it, threw down their arms and fled, leaving their dead and wounded on the field.
And with that, the critical Cold Harbor intersection was now in Federal hands. For Torbert's Union horsemen, seizing the crossroads had been an outstanding success, marred only by the fact that the Cavalry Division's 3rd Brigade, under Thomas Devon, had somehow failed to join the attack.
But this mistake only underscored the achievement of Merritt and Custer, since with 2 slender brigades, they had put to flight 4 Confederate brigades. Phil Sheridan, who arrived after the fight had ended, praised the troopers in his report, saying, quote, the fight on the part of our officers and men was very gallant. They were now beginning to accept nothing less than victory.
But a few hours' reflection sobered Sheridan a bit. From scouts and prisoners, he learned that another of Hoke's rebel infantry brigades had come up. The Confederate cavalry was still dangerous, and a second enemy infantry division might soon be arriving.
On the Federal side, Torbert had about 3,000 troopers in his 3 brigades, and the nearest Union infantry support was miles away. So, late that evening, Sheridan ordered Torbert to abandon the just won intersection and pull back. The Yankee cavalry withdrew so quietly that the rebels across the way didn't even realize they'd left. Sheridan reported his decision to give up Cold Harbor to Meade, telling him, quote, with the heavy odds against me here, I do not think it prudent to hold on.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth Podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.
Miles to the north of Cold Harbor on May 31st, the Army of the Potomac spent the day probing the Confederate defenses along the Totopotomoy, looking for any weakness in Robert E. Lee's lines.
By that evening, though, it was clear there was no obvious weak spot in the rebel lines, but there were indications that Lee was shifting his army to the right, possibly to dart around the Army of the Potomac and strike Baldy Smith's 18th Corps. Nothing would please Ulysses S. Grant more than if Lee did, in fact, leave his lines along the Totopotomoy, since Grant, for weeks, had wished for the chance to fight Lee in the open. But regardless of whether Lee intended to take the offensive or simply move to block Grant's shortest route to the James River, he would have to go to Cold Harbor. And Grant knew Sheridan was already there, and Baldy Smith's 18th Corps troops were on their way to the crossroads too.
At 9:45 that night, orders went out for Horatio Wright's 6th Corps to pull out of line and head for Cold Harbor as well. Ironically, that was just what Robert E. Lee wanted. Although he didn't yet know for certain that Baldy Smith's 18th Corps troops had disembarked at White House Landing, Lee nevertheless strongly suspected that Grant was making another turning movement. Any such move by the Yankees would have to go through Cold Harbor, and the Union cavalry's seizure of the crossroads on the 31st only confirmed Lee's suspicions about Grant's intentions.
Certain that he knew what Grant was up to, Robert E. Lee planned an ambush. The afternoon of the 31st, he issued orders for Richard Anderson's corps to pull out of line and march to Cold Harbor. This, of course, was James Longstreet's corps, now commanded by Anderson, after Longstreet was severely wounded by friendly fire in the Wilderness fighting. In any case, Anderson would march to Cold Harbor, unite with Hoke's division, and drive off the Union cavalry. Anderson and Hoke would then be in position to strike at any Federal turning movement while the Yankee infantry was strung out on the road and vulnerable. First, though, Anderson had to be pulled out of the Totopotomoy line. Well, this went off without a hitch, with Jubal Early's and A.P. Hill's troops smoothly filling in the gap when Anderson's men departed.
And so, on the night of May 31st, on the Confederate side, Anderson's corps was marching to Cold Harbor, while on the Federal side, Wright's 6th Corps was headed for the same destination. Also on the move was Sheridan's Union cavalry, because once Meade got Little Phil's report that he had abandoned the vital crossroads, he immediately ordered Sheridan to hustle back to Cold Harbor and hold the place, quote, at all hazards.
Sheridan got that message about 1 a.m. on the morning of June 1st, and 2 hours later his weary troopers began to reoccupy the crossroads, which, fortunately for little Phil, the rebels had never realized he'd abandoned. But now that he was back in possession of Cold Harbor, Sheridan fully expected the Confederates would hit him hard at dawn, and so he had his men work to improve their position during the remaining hours of darkness. Along some parts of the line, breastworks had to be constructed from scratch, while at other points, troopers discovered they could reverse the recently vacated Confederate works. Either way, the Yankee horse soldiers worked until they had good protection, then they lay down to get what sleep they could, with their carbines close at hand.
While Sheridan's cavalry troopers snuck back into Cold Harbor, the first of Anderson's Confederate infantry began arriving on the scene a mile to the northwest after midnight.
Major General Joseph Kershaw's division was at the head of Anderson's column, with Anderson's other two divisions strung out on the road behind. As a result, come morning, only Kershaw's troops were in position to attack the Yankees holding Cold Harbor. Robert Hoke had orders to support Kershaw's attack. When Hoke heard the firing that indicated the assault had started, he was to send his division forward too. Between them, Kershaw and Hoke commanded about 10,000 men, while across the way, Phil Sheridan had no more than 5,000 with which to stop them.
The Confederates attacked soon after daybreak on the morning of Wednesday, June 1st. On the Federal side, the troopers of Merritt's brigade were hunkered down in their works in the woods northwest of the crossroads. Because of the trees, Merritt's men couldn't see the Confederates, but could hear the shouted commands of their officers as they advanced.
When at last the rebels came into view, the Federals still held their fire, letting the enemy close the range. They noticed that, oddly, the Confederates were advancing without skirmishers. They also couldn't help but notice there was a high-ranking rebel officer, resplendent on horseback, evidently leading the attack, riding forward out in front of God and everyone. Then, when the dismounted Union cavalrymen finally opened fire, they worked their repeaters feverishly, pumping bullets out as fast as they could, and such was the incredible volume of fire that hit the advancing Confederates that their attack fell apart within minutes. The officer on horseback went down in the first volley. Well, the Confederates gathered themselves and came forward a second time, only to be repulsed again. Sheridan, who had expected he would have to make a desperate last-ditch stand, breathed a sigh of relief at the ease with which his troopers had stopped the enemy attack. At 9 a.m., Little Phil sent a message to Army headquarters, telling Meade, quote, "I have been very apprehensive, but General Wright is now coming up." End quote. And with the arrival of Wright's Federal infantry, Sheridan's worries were over.
Clearly, Robert E. Lee's plan had fizzled. As the Confederates began to ask how such a vital operation could misfire so badly, fingers started to point almost at once.
And it turned out that Dick Anderson had decided to precede the attack with a reconnaissance in force, and Division Commander Kershaw gave the mission to his old brigade, which on June 1st was led by Colonel Lawrence Kite of the 20th South Carolina. Kite and his regiment had joined the brigade just 2 days before. With 1,100 men on its roster, the 20th South Carolina easily doubled the brigade's strength, and jokers in other units dubbed it the 20th Army Corps.
The big 20th South Carolina may have brought numbers, but it also brought problems. Having spent most of its service performing garrison duty, few of its men had combat experience, and Colonel Kite was not one of them. What he did have, to the misfortune of the brigade, was a date of commission that made him the formation's senior colonel, and as a result, he took command of the brigade when he and his regiment arrived 2 days before the fight at Cold Harbor.
It was Kite, therefore, who received the order to make the reconnaissance in force that morning. It was Kite who tapped his own 20th South Carolina to lead the brigade, Kite who failed to deploy skirmishers, and Kite who rode into battle so conspicuously that the Michigan cavalry troopers watching him mortally wounded him with some of their first shots. Dozens of Kite's men were also hit, and those who survived that first volley were completely undone by their sudden and total immersion in combat.
One Confederate officer admitted, quote, "They actually groveled upon the ground and attempted to burrow under each other." He and another officer attempted to rally them, but, quote, "it was to no avail."
By itself, the disaster that befell Kite's brigade need not have derailed Anderson's entire attack, but it did create a great deal of confusion and revealed the inadequacy of the arrangements that had been made to coordinate with Hoke's division, which should have launched its own assault when Kite went forward, but instead didn't move. In fact, a kind of paralysis seemed to grip the Confederates after Kite's brigade met with disaster. Hoke's division failed to move forward, Kershaw didn't bother to renew the attack, and when the other two divisions of Anderson's corps arrived on the scene, they simply began to entrench. Well, corps commanders exist primarily to wield a strong hand in such situations, but here at Cold Harbor on the morning of June 1st, Dick Anderson, depending on how you choose to view it, he either failed to act or he acted ineffectually. Whatever the explanation, by late morning on the 1st, Robert E. Lee's plans for a counterstroke had come to nothing. Fortunately for the Confederates, the Federals were having troubles of their own, and we'll look at those next time.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Not War But Murder, Cold Harbor 1864 by Ernest B. Ferguson.
As always, you can find a complete list of our book recommendations at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Aaron and NC Jim did recently.
A big thank you to them, and thanks also to Jim C. for his donation.
Then, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.